So, as she said, I am presenting about the step-by-step process of APT attacks, but a little bit more about me. I am a junior cybersecurity and national security major with a minor in history. I am a co-team lead analyst at the AUCSSCD. I am also the Chief of Finance for Anderson University's Student Government Association. A little bit about me, I am Security and Network Plus certified, and if you want to learn more about me, you can look me up on LinkedIn. Okay, so a little bit about the basics. First, I'm going to start discussing the background of what cyber threat intelligence is, and then we will discuss the infamous 2014 Sony hack and conclude on why this matters to both you and me. So starting off with threat intelligence. So what is it? Cyber threat intelligence is evidence that threat intelligence analysts collect to correlate clues to specific threat actors. So your CTI analyst will often look for context, mechanisms, and indicators of advanced persistent threats so they can provide actionable intelligence on how to detect potential threats and how to remove them from infiltrated systems. So these attacks can include, this analysis can include how attacks are performed, who performs them, who the targets are, motives of attacks, and indicators of compromise. These indicators of compromise basically mean these are suggestions that, hey, something might be off with your network. So once they gather all this information, CTI analysts can use this to provide actionable recommendations to mitigate the risk of attacks, meaning that they reduce the risk associated with an attack. So advanced persistent threats, what are they? Well, they are entities. They can be either individuals or groups who perform cyber attacks on victims of their choosings. So these APTs are often very well resourced, they're experts in their fields, and oftentimes they either work for or with a nation-state actor. A common example is where a government will recruit an APT to go after their adversaries. However, a group can theoretically attack without nation-state backing. They could be a group aligned with different motives, beliefs, or ideologies. So these APTs are often performing long-term campaigns. They'll persist in a victim's network for a long period of time, hoping to remain undetected. So oftentimes governments and large-scale businesses are the victims of APT attacks. However, Kaspersky Labs has noted that there has been an increase on attacks on SMBs, small to medium-sized businesses. And this is because these APTs can kind of work their way up the supply chain to capture information of larger targets. So CTI is essential because it protects both governments and businesses from potential attacks by analyzing the attacks that have already occurred. So one of the most beneficial products of threat intelligence are, as I mentioned earlier, indicators of compromise, which gives an indication that there might be malicious activity on a network. So these IOC lists are different from your generalized IOCs, which if you think, oh, there might be malware on my device, it's because your device is running slow, some random command prompts pop up. But this isn't the case with APT indicators of compromise. Remember, these APT groups do not want to stay, they want to remain undetected. So these IOCs are going to be specific digital evidence that entities look for in their systems, and this could be things such as like IP addresses, emails, web domains, anything like that either your security products like your IDPS or maybe like your router will catch this going in and out. So then these entities, this is typically where your security product provider will step in. They will block these web domains and IP addresses using access control lists. However, if you have like end-of-life systems or you just don't have that security product and you're doing it all on your own, then you might have to manually add these as well. So CTI analysts, or your cyber threat intelligence analysts, track cyber threats and malware, and they'll monitor and analyze this threat intelligence to make these recommendations. So there are typically three ways that cyber threat intelligence analysts provide this information. It's either for operational, tactical, or strategical. Operational is where they provide this information to security upper management, such as chief information officers, chief information security officers, to influence cybersecurity decisions. Tactical, this is where you're actually in the field. So this would be SOC analysts, for example. They'll use this information to detect cyber attacks using these indicators of compromise, and they'll often use this to inform your cyber threat responders. Lastly is strategic, and this provides high-level threat intelligence to your high-level management. This isn't always security, but in general, it's just providing your management information about the global landscape. So If you look at this picture, you'll notice David Bianco's pyramid of pain. This pyramid describes how effective each piece of cyber threat intelligence is for attributing an attack to a nation-state actor. If you'll notice on the bottom, there's these hash values which it considers trivial. They're at the bottom, they're very common, and cyber threat intelligence analysts can use this to inform these indicators of compromise. However, this isn't always the most effective, and this is because if you guys know anything about like ransomware as a service, malware as a service, anyone can go out and buy this malware, use it, and it will not trace back to a single actor. Conversely, on the top, you'll see TTPs, which that stands for tactics, techniques, and procedures. And essentially, this is very rare, but it describes how a cyber threat actor works their way through a system. This is kind of like their signature. This is their footprint. And this is really important when attributing an APT. However, it's a lot less common. I'll talk a little bit more about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but this is really where it comes in common, where you have this database of this really useful information where you try to attribute an attack using this information. As for identifying APTs, there are two types of APTs. There's your knowns, there's your unknowns. For your suspected known APTs, this is pretty simple because CTI analysts can use the information they've gathered and compare it against a database, such as the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and see, okay, does this match up with something we've seen before? They may also use information regarding the exploit, the toolkit, maybe like who the common victim is, or they might just use open source intelligence. They do some research online and they're like, okay, I found this report from another CTI analyst who saw the same thing, and they said, oh, I know who this is. However, it's not always the case because there are constantly more and more APTs. So for suspected new APTs, you're going to identify any potential evidence using the aforementioned means, using your TTP analysis. However, you're going to gather this information, you're going to try and compare it to something you've seen before, and you're going to realize, hey, we haven't seen this before, so I'm coming up blank. So what your CTI analysts will do is they'll keep this information in their back pocket. And as they witness a similar attack, they're like, hey, I've seen this before, but I'm gathering new clues. So they're going to continue to gather these clues until they can create this profile. And they're constantly comparing this with the information of other CTI analysts to kind of verify. And eventually they will create a profile for a new APT. They'll create this list of indicators of compromise, and then they'll share the information with incident responders, companies, and other resource groups. The cyber kill chain. So the cyber kill chain is an invention of Lockheed Martin. It's actually based off of the military kill chain. And so this identifies the typical order in which an attacker moves through a network. So defenders can kind of identify an attack at any stage and kind of break the cyber kill chain. If you'll notice, step number 1 is reconnaissance. And so this is where you're not even performing the attack yet. You are just gathering information about your target. Until the very end, number 7, attacks, actions on objectives. And this is basically where you're in. Now you try to do whatever you wanted to do in the first place. It could be exfiltrate data, it could be maybe to erase data, as we see in the Sony hack. So first step is reconnaissance. And so here, the APT will gather information before performing the actual attack through either active or passive means. And so active, this is really what we think of. We think of kind of interacting with either the victim or maybe the victim systems. This is kind of what you see in the spy movies, where they're like pinging networks, they're performing vulnerability scans, maybe they're like calling the victim up on the phone and they're like, hey, what's your mother's maiden name? Something like that. But on the other hand, which is a lot more common, is your passive. And this is really just like Facebook stalking on steroids. You try to gather as much information you can on an individual to try and see their weaknesses. So after you do this reconnaissance, you get to weaponization. And here the attacker will develop a payload which will target the victim's weaknesses. And if you can see on the right here, I actually performed a white pages search on myself. Fortunately, nothing came up, but honestly, it's really simple, and it's kind of frighteningly scary how easy it is to perform passive reconnaissance on someone. Next, delivery. You have this malicious URL, you have this malicious link. how do you get it to your target? So here the APT is going to deliver the payload to the target. And they'll do this by sending an email with a malicious download URL. They might plug removable media into the device, looking at you, Ty. However, just because an attacker sends off this email or plugs in this USB doesn't mean it's actually going to do anything. So what this attacker tries to do is they try to either convince the victim to download or click on this malicious link, or if they're interacting with the system, they might need to actually get into the victim's account to download it. And then closely after that is installation. Once you're successfully able to exploit the vulnerability, you can install it onto the victim's system. Command and control. So this is a really confusing term. To simplify it, it's where the attacker establishes a connection to the victim device so it can interact back and forth. So this command and control server, often known as the C2 server, allows the APT to send commands to the victim system and hide their tracks by deleting logs. And then once they have this connection, the attacker can send commands to the victim device. Now it's time to have fun. Basically, the APT is going to use this during actions on objectives to achieve the goal they wanted to on what they wanted to do in the first place. Okay, so MITRE ATT&CK framework. So this is essential for any CTI analyst. It's basically a sort of repository, constantly updated knowledge base that provides information on publicly known TTPs. MITRE ATT&CK framework also will provide guidelines for determining adversary tactics, techniques, procedures, any sort of this common language. So any cybersecurity, expert can look up and they see this attack and they're like, okay, I know what this is. Okay, so now we got all that out of the way. I want to talk about the Lazarus Group 2014 Sony Hack. So just a little bit of background. On November 24th, 2014, some Sony employees walked into the office and saw a crazy screen. I have it on the next slide. And they found, oh, all their information was wiped and it's out on the web. What happened? So they walked into work November 24th, 2014. And they saw this sign. It said #GOP, which is the alias Guardians of Peace. What the Guardians of Peace actually is Lazarus Group, who is sponsored by North Korea. So what actually happened was Lazarus Group stole and leaked large amounts of data from Sony Studio, deleted original data off of their network, and demanded Sony stop the release of the interview. I don't know if you guys have seen the interview, but it doesn't talk too nicely about North Korea. So there's a potential motive there. Anyways, the after effects of this. So Lazarus Group, they hacked into the networks and posted 4 unreleased movies and another on a file sharing platform. They leaked thousands of confidential documents and communications. They leaked the personally identifiable information of almost 4,000 employees. They leaked scripts. They leaked payroll information. They leaked plans for future films. And they threatened to do much worse if Sony did not stop the release of the interview. And for a while they contemplated it. They actually said, okay, we'll stop. But if you guys know the ending of the story, you know that you can watch the interview online, and it's because they ended up releasing it. And as an advocate of AU, I'm not saying you should go out and watch the interview, but I'm also saying that it is an emblem of the fight against censorship, so do with that what you may. So how did they actually do this? So step number 1, reconnaissance. Lazarus did their homework. They performed reconnaissance by learning the names and emails of Sony employees through LinkedIn. And so after that, they took all this information, they got the emails, and they crafted and delivered specific spear phishing emails with malware attachments. So spear phishing emails, just a refresher, it's a type of phishing email that tries to convince someone to either download something or click on a link, and it's crafted very specifically where it would have the individual's name. It'll have personal information, so they are more than likely to click on the link. And so these spear phishing emails appeared to come from Facebook, Sony, Apple. A compromised computer in particular had an Adobe Flash file. That Flash file actually contained malware that infected the rest of the network. So during steps 4 and 5, the Sony staff were obviously not up to date on the security awareness training, and they clicked on the phishing links. They input their credentials, and they downloaded the malware. So during step 6, during command and control, so the compromised computers connected to hard-coded Chinese IP addresses. And then lastly, in step 7, Lazarus used a brute force attack on the victim's server message block protocol using the list of compromised credentials that it had gathered during that reconnaissance and during when they were inputting their credentials because of the spear phishing campaign. Okay. So after that, they're at step 7. They're at their actions on objectives. So what did they do? So Lazarus actually used a tool called Bramble, which is a server message block worm, to perform their final attack. So server message block, just a refresher, is a client-server communication protocol for file sharing. So the malware was able to transfer itself from one computer to another. So Lazarus's payload, it had 5 components. It had like a listening implant, lightweight backdoor, proxy tool, destructive hardware tool, destructive cleaning tool. So essentially, the listening implant, it listened in on ports 195 and 444. So upon the installation of this listening implant, it allowed the attacker to listen in on the victim's devices. As for the backdoor, this performed a lot of things. It actually opened up the victim network's firewall. It would transfer files, it would search for vulnerabilities, not good stuff. As for the proxy tool, it would allow the attacker to fingerprint the victim machine, perform directly listings, just to gather as much information as it could on Sony. As for the destructive hard drive tool, that one kind of seems self-explanatory. It destroyed their hard drives, and it attempted to destroy their VMs. However, it could only destroy VMs if it had the admin password. However, if that was unable to destroy the VMs, what would was the destructive target cleaning tool, which was specifically meant to destroy VMs by overwriting the master boot record. And then the network propagation wiper. So this spread malware through the network using the SMB protocol, and this wiped everything it could find. All right, as for the attribution process, how did we figure out this was Lazarus in the first place? So this is actually part and due to the FBI. So the FBI was dissecting certain pieces of malware used in the Sony hack. And they found that Lazarus had used the same email and IP address to attack another North Korean plotline of a TV show. Okay, they keep on attacking North Korean plot lines. Cool. But the FBI and Group IB had also attributed some of the similar malware, IP addresses, and emails to another attack on some SWIFT banking payments. So they already knew that the SWIFT banking payments attack was from Lazarus. And so they're like, oh, this is weird. They have the same email addresses. They have the same IP addresses. They have the same everything else. I wonder who it was. They also found that the Bramble worm had looked exactly like the WannaCry virus, which I don't know if you guys know much about WannaCry, but we already had attributed that to Lazarus Group. So this was pretty pin in the case. They knew who did it. So eventually, the FBI was later able to bring charges against Park Jin-hyuk for his role in the Sony hack and other cybercrimes. And I just want to point out this picture. It's kind of small here, but you can see on the very right you have all the victims, and then to the left of that is email addresses that were used to either send malware or, maybe interact with these systems during reconnaissance. And they found that there's one in particular that I'm not sure you can see, but it connects to both the Sony pictures and the Bangladesh bank. And if you look in general, this is very scattered. They're not one across, and that makes it a lot easier to attribute because similar attacks will share the same email address. So if you go through the MITRE framework, you can search for Destover, which was the malware, and learn about associated functions and how each part of the malware functioned to learn how to protect against it. You can also learn about the tactics used. You can learn about Lazarus Group, their campaigns, any of their tactics, anything like that. However, MITRE had no record of Destover before the attack. So when it came to the case of the FBI, they could not use that. However, it is still essential for CTI analysts to use this as a first stepping stone because this can provide a lot of information on these TTPs. Unfortunately, the FBI had to do a lot of searching on their own, but now in the future, we know we can protect against these attacks because we have this information stored. So, a conclusion. What does this all mean? So, research has found that cyber attacks do more than just digital damage. It does reputational damage as well. Additionally, it is essential for government to stay on top of these things because if they lose access or, some of their confidential information gets breached, that can be devastating. So CTI analysts and their work are beneficial for cybersecurity because they reduce the amounts of false alarms and they allow us to cut through everything to find out, okay, what do we actually need to do? How do we respond? And this is also nice because it provides job opportunities for cybersecurity majors and national security majors for people like me. Because I don't know if I want to work in government or cybersecurity, but with something like this, it provides the best of both worlds. So CTI is also essential for national security because it allows policymakers to make informed decisions regarding defensive security and know who the biggest threats are to our nations. Alrighty. Other than that, does anyone have any questions?
So,
yes.
Not specifically to the Sony breach, but do you think it's fair to say the single biggest takeaway from this is end user training? That was a spear phishing campaign. We had good training, didn't fall for the bait. Does that, in your opinion, seem to be the best first thing we can do for our end user base?
Yes, I would totally agree.